Welcome back to Things I'll Take It From Here, the podcast where we break down the choices storytellers make and sometimes ask how that story might work differently. Today we're talking about one of the biggest questions coming out of Bridgerton Season 4. How is Bridgerton going to tell the story of when he was wicked after changing Michael Stirling into Michaela Stirling? So let's get into it. In Season 3, the show revealed that Michael Stirling from the books has been changed to Michaela Stirling, meaning Francesca's eventual love interest is now a woman. And that change immediately raised a lot of questions for fans of the books, because Francesca's story in the novel is built around several really specific things. John's death, Michael inheriting the title of Earl of Kilmartin, along with the estate and home, and Francesca's struggle with infertility and her deep desire to become a mother. But now that Michael is Michaela, viewers are wondering how those story elements can still work, especially now that Francesca is not with child and her eventual partner is someone she cannot biologically have a child with. And it raises another big question. If Michael is now Michaela, how does the title of Earl of Kilmartin pass the way it does in the books? What makes this even more interesting is that the show itself acknowledges that the succession of Kilmartin is a serious issue. Lord Dundas, the representative for the House of Lords, the person who insisted that Francesca undergo an examination to confirm whether she is with child, warns that the crown has grown more stringent about succession and that there is not just a title and an estate at stake, but also a seat in the House of Lords. If you don't know who I'm talking about, he's the guy Benedict yells at and says he's had quite enough of the demands of society. Which, Benedict, I get it, same, but let's be honest, he was definitely talking about himself there. But I digress. The point is, the show makes it clear that the inheritance of Kilmartin isn't just about family, it's also about political power. So clearly the inheritance of Kilmartin is going to matter. Which brings us to the real question for today's episode. How could Bridgerton realistically adapt this story while still keeping the major elements that made Francesca's book so powerful? To answer that, we're going to break this down from a historical perspective. We'll talk about how titles actually worked in Britain and Scotland, what we know about queer relationships during the Regency era, and how women in those relationships sometimes built families, and finally, how the show could adopt Francesca's storyline while still preserving the emotional core of the book. Because once you start digging into the real history, the situation becomes far more complicated than it first appears. So let's start with the story from the book. In Julia Quinn's novel, When He Was Wicked, Francesca's story is very different from many of the other Bridgerton books. Francesca marries John Stirling, the Earl of Kilmartin, but then John dies suddenly, leaving Francesca widowed at a young age. At the same time, Francesca is dealing with something else that shapes her emotional journey in the book. She wants to be a mother. She becomes pregnant during her marriage, but suffers a miscarriage, and that loss stays with her. Years later, she reconnects with John's cousin, Michael Stirling, and Michael inherits the title of Earl of Kilmartin after John's death, and he has secretly been in love with Francesca for years. This relationship becomes one of the most emotional romances in the entire Bridgerton series. It deals with grief, guilt, longing, and the complicated reality that you can love more than one person in your lifetime. You can check out my breakdown on this book in an earlier podcast I recorded for more details if you want to know more about the book. But I will tell you, at the end of the story, Francesca finally becomes a mother, and when I say the end, I mean blink and you might miss it at the end, because it really is just thrown in there when the story already felt complete. But that storyline is one of the reasons book readers feel so protective of this particular romance. So when the show revealed that Michael had become Michaela, people immediately started wondering how those story beats could still work. And to answer that, we need to look at how titles actually worked historically. So John Stirling holds the title Earl of Kilmartin, and the show makes it clear that this is a Scottish earldom. And that detail matters more than people might realize. Most British noble noble titles followed something called heirs male, meaning the title could only pass to male descendants. But some titles were created with a different rule called heir general, regardless of gender, especially in Scotland, where inheritance rules for titles could sometimes be more flexible than they were in England. In those cases, women could inherit the title in their own right. And we actually have real historical examples of this. Anne O'Brien inherited the earldom of Orkney in the 18th century. Euphemia Leslie became Countess of Ross through the female line in Scotland, and women who inherited titles like this were known as peeresses in their own right, meaning women who legally held noble titles themselves. So if the fictional Kilmartin title were written with heirs general succession, Michaela Stirling could theoretically inherit it. But there's still another complication that the show introduces. In the series, Lord Dundas, the representative from the House of Lords, who insists that Francesca undergo an examination to confirm whether she is with child, warns that the crown has become more stringent about succession and that there is not just a title and an estate at stake, but there's also a seat in Parliament. So what does that actually mean? During the Regency era, many hereditary pairs, meaning nobles who inherited their titles through family lineage, automatically held seats in the House of Lords, which was one of two chambers of Parliament. The House of Commons was made up of elected representatives, but the House of Lords was made up of largely hereditary nobles, meaning titles passed down through generations of the same family. So if you were an earl, that title often came with political influence, which means Dundas is not just worried about inheritance in a social sense, he is worried about the political consequences. If the Kilmartin succession becomes unclear, the crown could intervene. The title could fall into dispute and the family could lose their influence in Parliament. But historically, there's another twist. Even when women inherited titles, they were not allowed to sit in the House of Lords during the Regency period. So, if Michaela inherited the title, she could legally hold the earldom and the estate, but she could not hold a seat in Parliament, which means Dundas's concern actually makes sense. The family might keep the title if Michaela is the only heir available, but lose their political power. And that raises the stakes of the succession issue even more. But there's another thing people are confused about. How could a lesbian couple even exists during the Regency era? A big misconception is that queer relationships didn't exist during the Regency era, but historically that's not true. They absolutely existed. They were just described differently. One example historians often discuss is something called a Boston marriage. They refer to two women living together in a long-term partnership where they shared a household and financial life. Some were platonic, but many historians believe some were romantic. One of the most famous examples from the early 19th century is Anne Lister. Anne Lister kept detailed diaries documenting her relationship with women. In 1834, she held a private commitment ceremony with her partner, Anne Walker. Historians often describe Anne Lister as one of the first openly documented lesbians in modern history. So while some same-sex marriage was not legally recognized, long-term partnerships between women absolutely existed, which brings us to another question. Could someone in Francesca's position still become a mother? The short answer is yes, but it would not look like a traditional marriage and family in the way we think of it today. Women in the Regency era sometimes reached children in a variety of ways. Some had children from previous marriages. Some raised relatives' children within their household. Informal fostering and guardianship were extremely common as well. Remember how Sophie was referred to as a ward even though she was actually Lord Pinwood's daughter? That's because it wasn't uncommon to raise children under the label of ward. Formal legal adoption didn't exist yet, but Extended family structures were very flexible. Another possibility is that a couple might privately arrange conception with a trusted male partner. So the idea that Francesca could still become a mother within an unconventional household is not historically impossible. And that leads us to the final question. How might the show actually adapt all of this into their story? So with all of that context in mind, there are really a few ways Bridgerton could handle this, but I'm going to focus on two. One, Michaela inherits Kilmartin if the earldom passes through heirs general. That would allow her to become the Countess of Kilmartin in her own right. The complication is that historically women could not sit in the House of the Lords, so the show could explore Michaela fighting for that political power, connected to the title while she and Francesca build a life together and possibly raise a ward or an orphan. Or two, the title passes to a distant young male relative and Francesca and Michaela bring that child into their household and raise him together. That preserves the title, the estate, and the seat at the House of Lords while still keeping Francesca's motherhood storyline. When you look at the real history behind titles, inheritance, queer relationships, and family structures, the situation is actually far more nuanced than the internet discourse might suggest. History is rarely as simple as we imagine it to be, and sometimes when you dig into it, you realize there were far more possibilities than we tend to assume. So thanks so much for listening to Thanks I'll Take It From Here. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcast, and follow me on TikTok and Instagram at takeitfromhere.media. I'll see you next time because I've had enough of the demands of society. Bye.